Hello everybody, good evening and welcome to your very own BYJU'S 6th, 7th and 8th grade channel. I'm your teacher Aishwarya and I welcome you to this particular video where we are going to discuss the chapter Respiration in Organisms in just under 30 minutes. And mind you, we will be summarizing the entire chapter today. Now this is a part of your rapid revision, the last lap as your exams are coming closer. This particular video will help you revise this chapter effectively. In case if you want an in-depth chapter explanation, you will find the link to the one shot in the description of this video. You can go ahead and click on that for an in-depth chapter explanation. But today, please mind you, we are only going to be summarizing it, that too efficiently under 30 minutes. So without wasting any more time, students, we will get started. Now, as you see, the chapter name here says respiration in organisms. So the first thing we need to understand is what is respiration and why are we studying about it. Now, respiration is also often known as cellular respiration, which can be defined as the process of breakdown of food within the cell in order to release energy. Now, often we see that this process of breakdown of food here is nothing but the digested food. And we know that the energy giving food are nothing but the carbohydrates. Now, one of the simplest form after digestion is glucose, right? And we know that here we see that when glucose is completely broken down, we see that it releases energy. And this process of breakdown of glucose is what we call as respiration. Now we see that energy is required to carry out various activities within our body, which is why it is a characteristic feature in living organisms. And we see that energy production happens in all living organisms. Now, of course, if you see this equation right here summarizes how exactly respiration takes place. So the food that we consume is first broken down into simple soluble forms, and we know that the energy giving food is nothing but the glucose. Glucose is broken down in order to release energy by cellular respiration. Now we see that it is not a one-step process that takes place. And as a matter of fact, we see that there are various types in which energy can be produced. Which is why we see that there are two types of respiration that takes place, or I would say two modes of respiration. Which is we have aerobic respiration and we have anaerobic respiration. So first up, let us learn about aerobic respiration in great detail. Now, aerobic respiration can be defined as the process of breakdown of glucose that takes place in the presence of oxygen. And we see that it is broken down in order to give us energy, and of course it gives out carbon dioxide as a byproduct or as a waste product. Now we see here that in this particular type of respiration, we see that there is complete breakdown of glucose. So we see that the glucose is broken down completely and we get energy. Now how is this energy obtained? Well, you see, energy is obtained in the form of ATP. Now, what is ATP? If I were to expand ATP, it stands for adenosine triphosphate. So we see that this right here is a chemical which acts as, or a chemical substance which acts as the energy currency. So when I say that energy is used for this reaction or that reaction, what they're effectively using is this ATP. And as a byproduct, what are we getting? We're getting carbon dioxide and water. And we see that in our body, most cells here perform aerobic respiration. Now we see here that this complete breakdown is taking place in the presence of oxygen. And we see that oxygen here is a key or is a crucial component. Now think about it. Oxygen is a gas which is there in our atmosphere. Now this oxygen somehow which is in our atmosphere has managed to reach all the way inside our cells so that our cells can perform respiration. So how exactly is it able to reach different cells of our body? Well, we see that there is an entire organ system that is dedicated so that it ensures that the oxygen in the environment enters into the body, and then we have another system which makes sure that it transports it to different parts. So we see that it is the human respiratory system that is involved. Now the human respiratory system that is there, of course, starts with the We see that if you were to look at the pathway of entry of oxygen, we see that it starts with the nose, right? So we see that the first part that is here is the nose, which is a structure that we see, which has two openings called as the nostrils. So we see that it starts with the nostrils, and the nostrils will now lead into a chamber called as the nasal chamber or the nasal passage. Now from here, the next part which gets involved is the pharynx. Now pharynx is a common opening. We see that it is a common opening for both air as well as food. Now from the pharynx, it will then open up into the larynx, which is the voice box, and from the larynx, it opens up into the trachea or the windpipe. Now as you can see, these are the different parts that make up the respiratory system. Now we see here that the trachea will descend downwards into the chest region, or what we call as the chest cavity, and it will split into two, forming bronchi, or what if I were to just refer to a single tube, it is called as bronchus. And we see that the trachea will split into two bronchi, which will open up into the lungs, right? So it opens up into these spongy structures which are called as the lungs. Now we see here that inside the lungs, the bronchus or the bronchi will start branching. And each branch is called as a bronchiole. And these bronchiole will end in these air sac-like structures called as alveoli. So when you take in air, right? So understand that you don't take in oxygen alone. You take in the air. But the air that you take in is rich in oxygen. So we see that air rich in oxygen enters through the nostrils, then reaches the nasal chamber. Now we see that inside the inner linings of the nasal chamber has a lot of hair and it has mucus that will trap any unwanted dust particles that might enter along with the air. And from there it will go down to the pharynx, then the larynx, and then it reaches the trachea. Now the trachea, if you see, is supported by C-shaped cartilaginous rings, not completely closed. They are C-shaped and they close it only from one side. What is the reason? So that it prevents the collapsing of the trachea. And we see here that from here they will branch further, forming bronchus that enters into each lungs. Now, lungs are spongy structures inside which we see that there are bronchioles that end with alveoli. Now, if you were to look at the structure of the alveoli, so if you were to look at one single alveoli, we call it as the alveolus. And we see that this alveolus that is there is a thin-walled structure, right? So we see that this right here is a thin-walled structure. And this alveolus is richly supplied with blood vessels. So we see that they are richly supplied with blood vessels. So effectively what happens when we breathe in air that is rich in oxygen. So all the oxygen is now reached all the way till the alveolus. Now from here we see that there is more oxygen present in the alveoli than in the blood, which is why we see that the oxygen will enter into the bloodstream by the process called as diffusion. Now what is diffusion? Diffusion can be defined as the process of movement of substances from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. So here we see that there is more oxygen, while here in the blood there is less oxygen. Hence it goes from the alveolus and into the bloodstream. Now the blood, of course, blood is responsible for transporting various substances to different parts and is also responsible for collecting waste material. So it brings in a lot of carbon dioxide from different parts of the body. Now, where is this carbon dioxide getting produced? We have just seen that carbon dioxide is a byproduct of respiration. So, we see that it is collected from all the cells and it is brought it back to the alveoli. Now, from here, we see that there is more carbon dioxide in the blood than in the alveolus, which is why now the carbon dioxide will go from the blood into the alveoli. Now, it is not that oxygen will go first, then carbon dioxide. This movement is happening simultaneously, which is why we call this as gaseous exchange. So we see that gaseous exchange takes place at the alveoli. And once the carbon dioxide has entered from the alveoli, it will go to the bronchioles, then the bronchi, trachea, larynx, pharynx, nasal passage, and out through the nostrils. So this is how we see that carbon dioxide exits out of the body. Now, if you see, we are able to, let's say, take in the air and give it out by a physical process. And this physical process that facilitates the entry of air rich in oxygen and exit of air rich in carbon dioxide, we call this physical process as breathing. And breathing consists of two steps. It consists of inhalation as well as exhalation. So inhalation is also known as inspiration, where we take in air that is rich in oxygen. While exhalation, which is also called as expiration, we see that this is where we give out air that is rich in carbon dioxide. Now understand that there is a difference between breathing and respiration. Breathing is a physical process that ensures that the body is able to take in air rich in oxygen and give out air rich in carbon dioxide. There is no chemical steps involved in this. While on the other hand, if you look at respiration, we see that that is a chemical process that happens inside the cells of our body, right? So this takes place inside the cells, and of course we see that there is chemical breakdown of glucose in order to release energy. So please know that they can ask you questions on differentiate between breathing and respiration, and I hope now you are clear. Now, how exactly are we able to do breathing? Now we see that there are two structures which are involved. That is the ribs and the diaphragm. Now the ribs are a cage-like structure, which is a bony cage-like structure, I would say, that helps in protecting the lungs. And diaphragm, as we all know, is a muscular dome-shaped structure that separates the chest cavity. So it separates the chest cavity from the abdominal cavity. Now when we inhale, we see that the rib cage moves up and outwards and the diaphragm flattens. So when the diaphragm flattens, it increases the volume inside the chest cavity, right? So when this moves downwards and this moves outwards, there is increase in volume. So we see that as a result of increase in volume, the air rushes into the body. While when we exhale, the exact opposite happens, where the ribs comes back to its original position, diaphragm moves back upwards into its dome-shaped structure, and we see that the volume that had increased has now decreased. As a result, what will happen? All the air is now forcefully expelled out, which is why we see that this right here is a major. We see that this right here is how breathing takes place, right? Or inhalation and exhalation takes place, and how we see that the ribs and the diaphragm contribute towards it. Now, if you see, one inhalation plus one exhalation is equal to one breath, right? So this is what we call as one breath. And the number of breaths that we take per minute. So number of breath that we take per minute is what we call as the breathing rate. And the breathing rate differs when we are resting to when we are, let's say, doing a normal activity or when we are physically exerting ourselves. So the breathing rate will continue to increase, especially when we are physically exerting ourselves or when we are doing some strenuous activity like doing exercise at the gym. Because we know that when we exercise, we require more amount of energy in the body, right? So more amount of energy is needed, which means that if more energy is needed, we need more oxygen also. That is why the number of breaths per minute increases. But in some cases, we see that despite the fact that we are taking in more oxygen by breathing, we see that it is still not enough. Which is why in some such cases, during strenuous activity, our body will switch towards something which we call as anaerobic respiration. Now in anaerobic respiration, we see that breakdown of glucose. So we see that breakdown of glucose takes place in the absence of oxygen. So we see that glucose gets broken down in the absence of oxygen. Now in our body, it results in the formation of lactic acid along with energy, and this takes place inside the muscle cells of our body. Now understand that this is something that can naturally happen in yeast as well. So organisms like yeast can do this normally as well, where they can break down glucose, and instead of producing lactic acid, they will produce alcohol, carbon dioxide and energy. Now students understand that when lactic acid is produced in large amounts and it starts to accumulate in the muscle cells of our body, we see that it can cause muscular cramps, right? So we see that it can cause muscular cramps, which is why normally making sure that we massage our legs, or put hot water bag on it, will improve circulation. And when circulation of the blood improves in our body, more oxygen is made available. Thereby what happens? We see that there is disappearance of lactic acid, and of course it eases up the muscular cramps. So this is all about aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Now mind you that the energy that gets produced in anaerobic respiration, say in our body, is much less when compared to aerobic. And in your examination, they can ask you to differentiate between aerobic and anaerobic, minimum at least for 3 marks. So be sure to mark these pointers. So this was all about how breathing and respiration takes place in our body. But we see that this is something that takes place in other animals as well. Just that not all animals have structures like lungs. Now, if we were to look at cockroaches, we see that in the case of cockroaches, they don't have structures called as lungs, but rather they have small openings on the side of their body called as spiracles, through which air rich in oxygen enters. So when they breathe in, the air enters through the spiracles, reaches the tracheal trunk. So those are branches that are there within the body that ultimately take it to different parts or different cells of the cockroach. And similarly, gaseous exchange happens. Carbon dioxide again travels back in the same way. So carbon dioxide from the cells go to tracheal trunk, spiracles, and then expels out of the body. While on the other hand, if you look at earthworms, we see that earthworms have an even simpler body where they don't have such openings. But rather, what do they have? We see that they have slimy, moist skin, right? So we see that they have slimy, moist skin wherein it directly diffuses into the body. And the cells utilize the oxygen, give out carbon dioxide that again go through the skin. So how exactly does breathing take place here? It is through the moist skin. Now these are animals which are found on land. But what about organisms which are found underwater, like fishes? So in the case of fishes, we see that they have structures called as gills. So we see that they take in the water. So here we see that oxygen is found dissolved in the water. So we see that they take in the water through their mouth, which eventually goes through the gills. Now here all the oxygen that is there enters into the bloodstream, gets transported to different parts, and all the carbon dioxide is then expelled out. So the gills here are very, very important. Now in the case of frogs, we know that they are not only found in water, but also in land. So how do they respire? Or rather, how do they breathe? In the case of frogs, when they are on land, they have lungs that help them to do the same. While when they are in water, they have moist skin that allows for gaseous exchange. So this was all about animals where we see that structures like spiracles or moist skin, or let's say we also see that lungs help in the breathing process. But what about plants? How about them? Now in the case of plants, we see that in the leaves, there are these small tiny openings called as stomata, which are found on the underside. And we see that stomata here facilitate gaseous exchange. Now mind you, in the case of plants, it gets a little complicated because we also know that there is another process that happens in plants, that is photosynthesis. Now for photosynthesis, carbon dioxide enters in through the stomata and we see oxygen expels out. So does this mean that when photosynthesis happens, respiration is not happening? That is not the case. Respiration is a process that is constantly happening in living organisms because energy is needed. Just that in the, let's say, in the morning time when there is sunlight, rate of photosynthesis is much more when compared to rate of respiration, which is why we see that at night time rate of respiration increases considerably, which is why normally it is not recommended to stand under a tree, especially during night time, because large amount of carbon dioxide can be given out through the plants, right? Because they are respiring, or the rate of respiration is much more at night. Now, apart from the stomata, we also see that roots have the ability to do the same, and they take up air through voids of the soil particles. So with this, everyone, as you see, we come to the end of today's class. Now, as you know, we have discussed the entire chapter of respiration in under 30 minutes. So I hope that you found this video helpful. So quickly to revise, I have a homework question for all of you, where in the comments of this video, I need you to tell me three differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So please let me know the answer in the comments of this video. I will definitely be checking them out. So thank you so much, students, for staying with me till the very end. I hope to see you all very soon. Up until then, take care, lots of love, and bye-bye.